Hi everyone, welcome to the Mummy Movie Podcast, where we are looking at Mummy's Revenge from 1975. So this is a Spanish film that also goes by the name, and I really hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, let's give it a go, La Venganza de la Momia. Again, I really hope I've said that correctly. I don't know Spanish, so apologies if it's badly done. In fact, this film is really bizarre in many ways, as outside of being Spanish, it holds a lot of similarities with other mummy movies of the time. In fact, for the most part, this film is actually set in London, but, well, everyone's speaking in Spanish. It is a little bit bizarre to see, but I suppose by the same token, we English-speaking countries do that to other cultures all the time. I mean, well, let's think of an example. You only have to look at the new Napoleon film to see that we've done that to the French. So it's just kind of weird being on the other side of that. It's a taste of our own medicine, if you will. Anyway, in terms of the format for the episode, we shall start with a look at the historical accuracy, and then I shall review the film and rate it out of 10. So we're talking about the normal format here. But before then, as usual, it is time for my dramatic intro. Right, you are an Egyptologist who has just discovered the intact tomb of Akhenaten, a pharaoh so evil that he was buried alive, thus forbidden an afterlife. You bring the body back to England to be examined. However, little do you realise that some of your colleagues have sinister motivations. Using the blood of 3 virgins, they raise the mummy from the dead. Now, not only is Akhenaten trying to bring back his ancient love of over 3,000 years, he is also wanting to harm those who oppose him. Soon, you will face the Mummy's Revenge. Okay, we have now arrived at the historical accuracy section. So here I shall simply go over the film, saying what it gets right and wrong in terms of history. And to be honest, this film is pretty interesting in this regard. One of the first things we see is the pharaoh, who is called Amenhotep, sitting on his throne. Amenhotep is wearing the white and red crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and well, this is accurate. To explain this crown, we need to go back to pre-dynastic Egypt, to a time before Egypt was unified. At this time, Egypt was split into 2 different lands. You had Upper Egypt, which was in the south, and you had Lower Egypt in the north. In Lower Egypt, the ruler wore the red crown, which is known as the Deshret crown. Then in Upper Egypt there was the white crown, named the Hadjet crown, which looks a little bit like a bowling pin. Then, in around about 3100 BC-ish, probably a little bit before then, a man named Narmer seems to have united the 2 lands, and it is at this point that the 2 crowns were merged into one, symbolising that he was the ruler of both lands. And when these 2 crowns were connected, Narmer morphed into a large monster superhero type thing, just like the Power Rangers. Well, okay, that last bit is made up, but, well, you can't deny that would be cool, though. Anyway, the film then goes on to claim that Amenhotep ruled during the 18th dynasty. And again, this is correct. There's no issue here. There were actually 4 kings named Amenhotep, and they all ruled during this time. The last of these kings, Amenhotep IV, later changed his name to Akhenaten, and it does seem that the pharaoh in this film has taken a fair amount of inspiration from him. Akhenaten was a very controversial pharaoh who is known to have placed the Aten, the god representing the disk of the sun, above all other gods. And although there is much debate on the subject, many would argue that, as such, he created the first ever monotheistic religion with Atenism. One of the reasons that many people believe this is because, for a large part of his reign, he seems to have been openly hostile to many of the other gods, most notably the god of Amen, who I'll discuss a little later in this episode. And at best, when it came to the other gods, he was basically just indifferent to them. The temples and cults of these gods saw their funds running dry, as much of the wealth went towards Akhenaten's newly built capital, named Akhetaten, and the cult of the Aten. For myself, I would probably place Akhenaten as more of a henotheist rather than a monotheist, just because I don't think he was necessarily disbelieving the other gods. It's just he was either openly hostile to them or he just didn't like them. But I definitely do get the argument that he's monotheistic, and I agree that there's definitely a lot of room for debate there. In fairness, Amenhotep in this film does have some significant differences to Akhenaten. For a start, pretty much everything I've already just spoken about doesn't apply to him. He is said to worship many gods. So he is essentially missing the most famous aspect of Akhenaten, but even so, there's still some very clear inspiration here. For a start, he is despised by the High Priest of Amen in the film, who ends up poisoning him. In real life, the High Priest of Amen almost certainly didn't poison Akhenaten. We don't actually know how Akhenaten died. But on the other side of it, the cult of Amen was the main cult that Akhenaten had an issue with. In fact, during his reign, he used the military in the country to erase every mention of the god Amen, and even got a soldier to shimmy up the obelisk of Hatshepsut to erase an instance of the god's name there. On top of that, the queen of Amenhotep in the film is called Amarna. In reality, there was never any queen in Egypt called Amarna. However, the modern name for the location of Akhetaten, the capital of Akhenaten, is known as Amarna, so again, very clear influence here. This capital was only used by Akhenaten and very briefly by his descendants, including Tutankhamun, who was actually the one to move the capital back to Thebes. As such, although used incorrectly, there is clear influence from Amenhotep IV, e.g. Akhenaten, in the villain of this film. One further inaccuracy here is that the film claims that this pharaoh sacrificed virgins in order to bring him luck in battle. This is purely fictitious. Neither during the Amarna period when Akhenaten was reigning, nor any other time in Egyptian history were sacrifices used in this way. And in fact, the only evidence for human sacrifice in Egypt at all comes from the First Dynasty. This time period was over 1,500 years before the time of Akhenaten. Later still, we find out that the mummy has been buried with a papyrus. This papyrus is related to the temple at Bubastis. It is then claimed that Bubastis was only fabled before that moment. In fairness, Bubastis is a real place, but I can say with near certainty it was never seen as a mere fabled location. I will admit, this feels like they have just picked a random location in Egypt and claimed that Amenhotep was heavily linked to it. Bubastis was actually a city in lower, so northern, Egypt, and was the cult centre of the goddess Bastet. So I've spoken about Bastet before on this podcast, but I'll just go over it again a little bit. For the majority of Egyptian history, Bastet was a lioness-headed goddess. Originally, she was a warrior goddess, as ferocious as a lion and heavily linked to the sun god Ra, as she was one of his daughters. Then, after around about 1000 BC, she became more commonly shown as a cat-headed goddess. In this form, she was far tamer. She could be approached and stroked, and was more a danger to mice and other rodents. Interestingly, although Bastet had always been a well-respected goddess, her popularity seems to have surged with this change to a cat-headed goddess. But, essentially, when it comes to this film, the use of Bubastis here is incredibly random. Later on, we are introduced to our main sort of modern villains, intent on raising the mummy from the dead. They claim that, in order to raise him, they need the blood of 3 virgins. This blood will then be mixed with a lotus flower, the flower of life. Although the virgin blood idea here is, unsurprisingly, utter nonsense, The idea of the lotus flower as a plant of life is not entirely unfounded. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't used to bring mummies back from the dead, but the idea of it as a kind of like plant of life, there is something there. Lotus flowers were heavily associated with regeneration and the kind of like rising sun. Basically, it was noticed that at night, lotus flowers close up, and then when the sun rises, they open again. The Egyptians also noticed that the middle of the lotus flower is yellow, much like the sun. Okay, it's going to start getting a little bit random seeming now, so I'm going to start with something that a lot of my regular listeners will already know, because I've spoken about this quite a few times on this podcast. The sun was believed to get born in the morning, grow older throughout the day as it travelled across the sky, and then sink and die in the west at night. It would then pass through the underworld and rise again newly born in the morning. This next bit is going to sound very random, but please do stay with me. It will all kind of come full circle. Again, I've spoken about this a bit on the podcast, but the Egyptians also likened the sun to a ball of dung being rolled along the ground by a scarab beetle. They also noticed that from this ball of dung, other beetles emerged. In reality, these beetles actually emerged from the ball of dung as the scarab beetle kept its spawn in there. But to the Egyptians, it simply looked like these beetles were self-created. They, created themselves. As such, because of this association the sun had with the ball of dung being rolled along the ground, it was believed that the sun was rolled out from the underworld by a god named Khepri, who was depicted as, unsurprisingly, a scarab beetle. And so, much like the spawn coming from the ball of dung, Ra, the sun god, was believed to be self-created. As such, this association the lotus flower has with the sun also means that it does have associations with regeneration. It is hard to explain this in short, and I hope this does make sense. I know it is very complicated, it's incredibly hard to get your head around, but put simply, the idea of the lotus flower being associated with life is not entirely incorrect. Anyway, moving on. When Amenhotep rises from the dead, at one point he talks about the 42 spirits he's supposed to worship. I believe that this is likely a reference to what are called the 42 judges in ancient Egypt. These 42 judges are linked to the weighing of the heart ceremony, which I have spoken about, well, a whole bunch on this podcast. It seems to come up all the time. Essentially, in order to enter the field of reeds, which can kind of be likened to heaven in the modern context, the deceased would have to get their heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which can also, I suppose, be called the feather of cosmic order or the feather of truth. If the deceased's heart was heavy with sin, then it would be heavier than the feather. As such, the scales would tilt down, and their heart would be torn apart by a terrible goddess named Amit the Devourer, who was part lioness, part crocodile, and part hippo, some of the most fearsome animals in ancient Egypt. However, if the deceased was free from sin, then their heart would be as light as the feather, and the scales would be balanced. Now, the part we're actually interested in here comes just before this weighing of the actual heart. When the deceased would first enter the hall where the ceremony would take place, they would have to give negative confessions to 42 judges around the hall. These were things like, I did not steal and I did not kill, that kind of thing. These 42 judges represented the 42 provinces of Upper and Lower Egypt. Of these, other than Osiris, who sat at the head, there were 9 that were the most important. These were Ra, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Isis, Nephis, Horus, and Hathor. So once again, it is likely that this film had no idea what these 42 judges were, that it's talking about, but the idea of these 42 judges does have some foundation in Egyptian religion. Finally, At one point in the film, it is claimed that those who first excavated the tombs of Ramesses II and Thutmose III met untimely ends. The film then links this to a curse. When it comes to the tomb of Ramesses II, KV7, so that's King's Valley 7, the Valley of the Kings, the first two people to excavate this were Henry Salt and Champollion, both in 1829. In fairness, I suppose, both men did die in their 40s, but certainly not because, of anything to do with the tomb of Ramesses II, and definitely not to do with a curse. As for the tomb of Thutmose III, this is KV34, and was first excavated by Victor Loret, or, well, at least so he claims. Some Egyptologists do dispute this. He died at the old age of 86, so once again, I feel it's pretty fair to say he didn't die of a curse to do with that tomb. Overall, this film does use a lot of ideas from ancient Egypt. It correctly labels the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, and is correct that King Amenhotep was from the 18th dynasty. There were 4 pharaohs who went by this name, and they all did indeed come from this dynasty. It is also correct that lotus flowers were linked to life. However, a lot of the time, the film's approach to history seems very cluttered, and almost has a feel of a kind of like child playing with Lego. They've got multiple different sets and they're all kind of jumbled up. For instance, it randomly adds the city of Bastet, the cult centre of Bastet, into the mix, when Bastet was not present in the story or film at all. It claims that the pharaoh worshipped 42 spirits, clearly referencing the 42 judges in the Hall of Truth, and it borrows heavily from the Amarna period, with all of the elements being incorrect. For instance, it has Amarna being the name of Amenhotep's wife, rather than being the area of Akhenaten's capital. Basically put, although many of the elements in this film are based on Egyptian history, their use is often completely cluttered, random, and for a large part, completely incorrect. Okay, we have now arrived at the review section. So as usual, I'm just going to go over the film, saying what I like and dislike, and then rate the film out of 10. I actually felt the film had a pretty good sort of first half hour or so, though I will admit the first scene did make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. Basically, it starts in ancient Egypt with Amenhotep ordering several young virgins to be killed for his entertainment. As I said, this did make me feel uncomfortable, but I suppose it was meant to, and in fairness, it definitely did leave the viewer in no doubt as to who the villain in this film will be. After this scene, Amenhotep was genuinely unlikable, so I suppose it did succeed in its goal. As well as this, I felt the aesthetic of the film was really good. This is apparent right from the beginning and throughout. It is quite dark, and it effectively shows some of the characters as being just a little bit off. So, for instance, the High Priest of Amen has had makeup done to depict him as older. But it has also been done to almost give him an uncanny valley feel that is just a tiny bit unsettling. I think it's because his eyes still look quite young. Or in another part, we see the tomb of Amenhotep in ancient Egypt. Then, I'm not entirely sure how they did this, but suddenly the screen darkens, and as it does, spiderwebs appear around the coffin as we transition to the modern day. Like I say, this film was made in the 70s, and I thought this looked really good. It was well done. Or in another instance, towards the end of the film, we see one of the characters, I'm not going to say who to avoid spoilers, turn quickly into a skeleton. This is done using practical effects, and, well, I'm guessing it was stop motion, but I'm not entirely sure. But basically, we see their skin fall into the various sockets in their face before completely disintegrating. It's a really interesting effect, and definitely not in a bad way. So basically, not only is the film aesthetically really good, but the effects are well done for the time as well. I genuinely feel they are really inventive. Some of the characters are also really quirky, and I personally love that. For instance, we have Dr. Douglas Carter, because of course you've got to have a character in these films that has a second name Carter. You just have to, don't you? But basically, he is an old man in a wheelchair. He is an Egyptologist who has decided to live in the museum because that way he's closer to the artifacts and his work. I love little things like this, and I do think it gives the film and its characters a certain level of personality and quirkiness. When it comes to the actual mummy, although his appearance is a little hit and miss, as I shall go over in a bit, I do like that they've made him look a little bit different. Although he's still covered in bandages, they are far greyer than in any other mummy movie, and his face is completely devoid of any natural colour. Further, he is still adorned by the jewellery he was buried with. And this feels like an obvious thing to have for these mummies, but I can't think of another film that does that. On top of that, the mummy here is not a brainless servant, as you would see in other mummy movies from this time, and from the 40s, 50s and 60s for that matter. Although he has been brought back to life by the modern bad guys in the film, he is very much the one in charge and has clearly been inspired by the 1932 Boris Karloff film. Though, that being said, he does still hold some of the similarities of the classic mummy villain, as he does still have super strength and a thirst for blood and violence. In this way, I suppose he's something of a hybrid of the two types. Further, in the first half hour, the film does a really good job of building the anticipation of the mummy rising from the dead. At this point, the film was still very much keeping my interest, and I wanted to see what the mummy would look like and kind of how it would act as well. Finally, there were some unique scenes here that really helped the film to stand out. So for instance, in a scene with some excellent cinematography, Dr. Douglas Carter is sat by the fire on a stormy night. A flash of lightning lights up the room, and it is only then that you see the mummy in the background. Even now, I'm not sure if the mummy had been there the entire time. The mummy then hits Dr. Douglas Carter on the back of the head, and he falls forward, his head partially in the fire. Not only did this make me wince, but it showed really effectively how badly Dr. Carter had been hit. He did not flinch at all as he landed in the fire, and it was hard to know whether he was knocked out or whether his injuries were more severe than that, whether he had survived at all. Really effective stuff. Now, of course, this film is still very much of its time, and although I was not able to find the budget, I'm going to guess it wasn't exactly high. This does lead to some parts which, although not outright bad, are unintentionally quite charming and funny. So, for instance, the coffin of the mummy is very cheap looking and has clearly been made from thin wood. Also, as well as seeming strange having a Spanish film set in London, the dubbing for this film was quite poorly done at times. Yes, I did watch this film in the dubbed version. To be honest with you, this film was hard enough to find as it was. For a start, none of the voice actors knew how to say papyrus, and instead they all said papyrus. In general as well, most of the voice actors, especially when it came to the side parts, all just seemed to yell their lines. Like, for instance, there's one part where a man and a woman are basically fooling around in secret, and they're supposed to be sort of like whispering and giggling, but all of the lines are really loud. It just comes off as very bizarre and admittedly quite funny. And then you have Akhenaten, the mummy himself, who sounds like Skeletor, but if Skeletor were to be asking you to get pictures of Spider-Man for him. In fact, in this regard, the mummy here is really funny because, okay, he does sound a little bit evil, but he also just kind of sounds grumpy. Further, although I can appreciate that they've tried something different with this mummy in terms of his appearance, a lot of the time, it is clearly just a man in a suit. I'm not entirely sure why, but he kind of reminds me of a slightly greyer version of a mix between RoboCop when he's taken off his mask and Crichton from Red Dwarf for any fans of that show. I think it's something to do with his eyes being quite clearly behind a lot of makeup, and one particular bandage he has kind of like framing his face. Now, on the downside, although the film is pretty unique in many ways, the story is still overall very generic, and as such, you can kind of see all the beats before they happen. They still have the man who wants to raise the mummy from the dead as an evil Egyptian. They have the whole part where the mummy is looking for a host for the spirit of his beloved, and the whole time it's really obviously going to be the main female lead. Call these cliches, call them tropes, they are still way too obvious here regardless. On top of that, the film does an absolutely awful job of pacing. This is especially true in the second half. At this point, the mummy is trying to get hold of 7 women to see who Amarna, his love, can inhabit. But then the film goes out of its way to show you how each of these women are taken. It almost plays like an anthology film, but with all of the stories being exactly the same and without enough time to develop them in any way, shape or form. I guess the film has done this to try and be a bit different, but it was a big swing and a miss. Especially considering that, as I said earlier, all along it's really obvious that the main female lead will be the one that he wants. So really, this whole part just basically is done to drag the film's length out, and it does so in a way that's incredibly detrimental. Overall, however, there are some really cool ideas here. I feel for the most part the atmosphere and presentation of the film is really good, and I like that they have tried something different with the mummy, even if it is to mixed results. However, on the downside, this film is very much held back by incredibly poor pacing and an incredibly predictable plot. In all honesty, I had trouble knowing what to rate this one. It definitely is a unique film, and there are some really strong elements here, but it is weighed down by one too many flaws. Great cinematography, some fun characters, but ultimately, it is a generic story that is badly told. For this film, I am giving it a 5 out of 10. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you have, why not consider liking it, leaving a comment, subscribing, it all really helps, and join me next week, where we shall be examining Day of the Mummy from 2014, a film that stars Danny Glover, so, that's quite fun. I hope you all have an excellent week, and see you then.